Hey there guys, today we're taking a look at Batman Arkham City running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5500U, this time with 16 gigabytes of RAM. Now the game is currently running right now at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics settings. So that is with the low preset running with DirectX 9. The reason I'm not using DirectX 11 is that DirectX 11 has always had issues in this game, and it really seems like they never ended up fixing that. It was one of those first games that actually ended up coming out with DX11, and the transition to DX11 was a little rough sometimes. It's very similar to the transition to DirectX 12, where a lot of games have a DirectX 12 implementation that a lot of the times actually performs worse than DirectX 11 just because it's a new API that they were, working on and stuff like that. Think games like The Division and Battlefront 2. So this is a similar situation. So DirectX 9 is really the way to go when you actually want to play the game. The level of performance that we're getting here at the lowest in-game graphics settings with the stock 15-watt TDP is actually pretty impressive here. We have 1% lows that are in the mid 40s and our averages are well above 60, and we're still at the full 1080p resolution. And quick things I want to mention, you can go down below to actually look at the guide that I used to actually unlock the frame rate in this game, because it actually has a default 62 FPS cap, and you can pretty much unlock that to whatever you want without really breaking anything in game. It's simply about changing a couple of lines in a specific file. So again, go down to the description and you'll see the guide on how to do that, because the chip can actually deliver more performance if you're willing to play at these lower settings. But if you want to turn up the graphics settings, we can look at what it's like in all of the different settings at the stock TDP. So if we switch over to the medium preset, you can see here that we do take a hit in the averages and 1% lows here, though overall the experience is still very playable and very enjoyable, with averages that are still at a 60 FPS range and 1% lows that, while being under 40, they're not too far off from there. And overall, if you look at the frame time charts, which really is the biggest indicator on what the performance is like, you'll see that it's relatively smooth. It's going to be a overall very enjoyable experience. You'll see that the 1% lows really aren't going to be too detrimental to the overall experience. You'll have the occasional spike, but that's really going to be in situations where you're kind of just moving at high speeds, really in situations where combat isn't really going to be happening. Now, if we move over to the high preset, this is where things start to get a little bit more rough. We are still getting averages that are pretty decent here, and the 1% lows of 30, while a little low, aren't exactly going to be super detrimental to the overall experience, and this is still going to be fully playable. We are now running at the high graphics settings. You can see that there's more reflections on the ground and stuff like that, though overall I don't really think visually it's worth the upgrade over medium. I would really just turn up the texture quality and leave things at the medium settings, because a lot of the extra effects really aren't super necessary. But I can understand if you're someone that's super into the graphics of the game that you would want to have them at the highest that you could reasonably try to play the game with. And overall, it is still a playable experience like this, though not exactly the greatest experience. And overall, it's still going to be a very enjoyable experience. Now, going to the very high graphics settings, this is where things start to get a little bit too rough in a lot of sections. Specifically, the averages themselves are actually okay, though going into the mid 40s for averages is going to be pretty rough considering where we were able to get to at the lower graphics setting. But it's still a relatively playable experience, though you'll see that the frame time charts are really starting to act up a bit more. But the 1% lows aren't too far off from 30, but it's still one of those things where, visually speaking, I honestly cannot tell you what is different between the high setting. So I don't know why you would want to do this to your frame rate. But we are teetering on the edge of this being a really good experience. If we could just boost those 1% lows and get those averages a bit higher, this could realistically be a very playable experience. And this is at the high graphic, or at the very high graphics setting. So when we use the APU tuning utility to set the chip to the performance mode, which is about a TDP target of around 30, though it doesn't really end up hitting that a lot of the time. It seems to fluctuate a lot, but the level of performance that we're getting here is, while an improvement, it wasn't as big of a jump as I was hoping to see, though it does overall make the experience a lot better. You'll still see that the frame time charts are really bouncing around a lot, and overall it's not going to be that great of an experience here, but that does mean that you can just drop the graphics down to high and you'll probably be able to actually get some very solid performance there. So it really just seems like we're pushing it, just trying to get very high on here, but it is an improvement and it is more playable. playable like this. And honestly, you could probably get away with playing the whole game like that. Now, if we take a look at it running with the balance preset, which pretty much goes for a target TDP of anywhere between 22 to 25 watts. It really just depends on the situation. The performance that we're getting here is decent enough. I pretty much had to turn down the graphics settings down to the high preset instead of the very high so that we can actually get a passable experience here. And this is really the bare minimum graphics settings that I would go with to try to play this game, because overall the experience here is really enjoyable. It felt a lot better than going with the very high settings. So I would really recommend that the game, for the most part, just keep it at most to the high setting. Very high is really just going to be unnecessary load being put on the system. But overall, the experience of playing it like this at the high preset is actually really good. Even if I wish that the 1% lows were just a tiny bit better, if they were really going into the mid 40s, I would be very happy with this. But honestly, you could get away with playing the game like this, and really, unless you're going to be super sensitive to frame rate, I really don't think you're going to have too much trouble trying to play the game like this. And of course, the last APU tuning utility preset we're going to be taking a look at is the battery saver one, which pretty much sets the TDP to 8 watts. The performance that we're getting here at the high preset is not exactly the greatest experience. It's obviously not going to be how I would expect most people to play the game. It's just not really doable. The 1% lows are laughable, although the averages at 30 is actually kind of surprising. You know, it means that if you grew up playing this on the PlayStation 3, this might be a similar experience, except it's at a higher resolution, because you got to remember that back then, the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 were pretty much more like 540p machines. They weren't exactly going for that super high resolution, even though they had HDMI ports and can do, 1080p video and stuff like that. It wasn't something that you could do in the actual games themselves. They were rendered at a lower resolution and then upscaled. But all my attempts to really try to get this to be playable at the 8 watt TDP were complete failures in the sense of running it at 1080p. I'm sure if we drop the resolution, you could probably get some playable frame rates here, but you can just play the game at 1080p. Why would you play this at this low of a wattage just to, I don't know, save battery, I guess? It's one of those things where this is one of those presets that realistically you'll never use in gaming. It's mostly just there just to see how the chip scales in this game. And as you can see, it doesn't really do that good of a job, where even at lowest graphical setting, we're still running into issues here. I mean, you'll see the frame time charts kind of just dance around all over the place. So really, overall, this is going to be a rough experience. But really, it seems like the most ideal settings to play this game at is going to be with the balance preset and going with the high graphics settings at the very most. If you want to squeeze out a little bit more, you can always go medium or even go down to low if you want a high frame rate experience. But overall, this is pretty much what I would consider to be the most playable experience that you can get without going into the very high TDPs. Obviously, if you want to go for the performance mode, you're going to be able to actually play the game even at the very high settings, though. Just stick to high and enjoy the increase in the 1% lows. But anyways, I hope you found this video useful. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I will catch you guys in the next one.